Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Hello. Meik Wiking is so happy here with us, and we are so happy here with him that he's actually here in the same room for the second time. For those of you who have been here at 4 p.m., you know that he is one of the most renowned happiness specialists in the world. His book, Lykke, when I first interviewed him 2 months ago, was translated into 28 languages. Now, as we speak, it's already translated into 38 languages. I just certified the number. So his fame is growing in enormous speed. His second talk is going to be more concentrated on happiness and kindness, with sort of the concentration on like the 6, Mike, right? The 6 special phenomenon, which is social support, health, money, trust, kindness, and
I lost track.
But I have it
Freedom.
written here. Social support, health, money, freedom, the core issue for the United States. Trust and kindness. It will be a presentation in a similar way as it was in the afternoon, and there'll be, of course, the floor for your questions on the end. There'll be time enough. It's enough when you just raise your hand. I'm also supposed to say that those 2 events have been organized in collaboration with the Karla Janečka Foundation, and then I'll just leave and wish you the happiness.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for coming. How many were here at 4 as well? I reckon okay. That means I can't repeat the jokes. That's fine. But thanks for coming, and thanks for coming again for those of you. So I'll talk for about 55 minutes. I'll try to leave in some questions in the end. If there's something that's unclear during the presentation, just raise your hand and we'll try to solve it right away. So I come from the Happiness Research Institute in Copenhagen, and I've been working with happiness research for the past 6 years. And when people hear you work with happiness research, they imagine my everyday looks like this. And as I said earlier, that our office is full of puppies and ice cream. That's unfortunately not the case. It looks more like this. So we look at numbers, we look at statistics, we look at data, and try to have a scientific approach to happiness. So basically, we try to answer 3 questions. How can we measure happiness? Why are some people happier than others? And how do we improve quality of life? And it's also those questions that I'll be trying to address for the next 50 or 55 minutes. So, the political context, I also wanted to say a few things about that, because these are really exciting times to be a happiness researcher. And it is because we see more and more politicians, political organizations looking at well-being measures, looking at measuring progress in other senses than just dollars and cents. So back in 2012, the United Nations, they passed a happiness resolution. And it basically asks all the countries of the world to focus more on happiness and put quality of life at the core of what they're trying to achieve. It's also the UN that publishes the World Happiness Report, an annual list of happiness levels around the world. We also have a sort of fairly conservative, financially oriented organizations like the OECD, saying that, well, we should be looking at, yes, are people getting richer, but also importantly, are people getting happier? So when you get back home from Meltingpot, look up your Better Life Index, and that will show you 11 indicators you can choose from in terms of creating your own happiness index. You know, what matters to you might be health, education, and housing. and for other people it might be unemployment and the environment. But here you can create an index where you can look at what matters to you. So we also have different governments starting to measure quality of life, well-being as the measure of progress. Instead of just saying, are we getting richer, then asking, are we getting happier? And I think that's wonderful. Because I think the way we've been measuring progress for decades is wrong. It's essentially meeting Thomas, my friend, and then saying, instead of how you doing, saying, when I ask him how you're doing, he says, I make 10,000 euros per year. It's not really what I asked. And it does give me some idea of the answer, but I'm actually asking him how he feels. And that is what governments are doing now. Yes, saying that our wealth do matter, but so do our well-being. How do we feel about our lives? And I think it's great to see governments moving in that direction. Famously, Bhutan, we have our Bhutanese expert here who did a presentation on that earlier today. For those of you that do not know Bhutan, it's a really interesting country because they measure gross national happiness. So instead of just focusing on people getting richer, measuring gross national product, they ask, are people getting happier? And every political decision in the country is based on, is this going to improve quality of life for our people or not? And I think that's wonderful. We also see one of the latest initiatives coming out of the Middle East. So the lady on the right is Uhud al-Rumi, and she is the Minister of State for Happiness in the UAE. So her job is to get the UAE to, I think it's top 5 in the World Happiness Report by 2021. They're one of the 7th richest countries in the world, but now they want to be one of the happiest. And I think that's really encouraging to see more countries embracing these softer measures of progress. So I'm just going to look at my phone, as mentioned earlier, not to chat Instagram, but just to make sure that I am keeping track of time. So great to see more and more countries looking at well-being measures. I think one of the reasons why we see that is that politicians are becoming aware that the way we've been measuring progress is wrong. So one of the evidence of that is this graph, which shows the economic development in Egypt leading up to the Arab Spring. So in that 5-year period, up to the revolution, how did happiness levels, or how did economic levels increase? And it looks like things are going really well. We saw the same development in Tunisia. Things are improving, people are getting richer. But if we looked at how are people feeling about their lives, we could see that drop to 1/3 of what it used to be. So people were getting richer without getting happier. And therefore, well-being was a better measure of what the sentiment of the people was leading up to the Arab Spring. I think that's why more politicians are interested in well-being. So one of the core questions in our work is, of course, how do we measure well-being, quality of life? That is the key challenge. It's also why I'm going gray, even though I'm not that old, but it's a super challenging and difficult question to answer. And whether we talk about well-being, happiness, quality of life, all of them have the same challenge, that it's a wide umbrella term. So Thomas has one understanding of what well-being is. I have another one. So what we need to do when we look at these concepts is we need to acknowledge their umbrella terms and break them down into different components. And it's actually also what we do when we talk about other umbrella terms. If we talked about how's the Czech economy doing, we would break that down and talk about inflation, unemployment rates, interest rates, GDP levels, growth. And that gives us a language to talk about how's the Czech economy doing. And that's also what we need to do with happiness, breaking it down and looking at different components. So, when I try to measure happiness, and when we and the UN try to measure happiness, we look at least 3 different dimensions. We look at overall life satisfaction. Basically taking a step back and evaluating your life. considering the worst possible life you could live, the best possible life you could live, where do you feel you stand right now? It's a very stable measure. People answer the same today as they did 2 weeks ago. Very stable. It's also the dimension that is usually fed into the World Happiness Report. The second dimension is much more volatile. It goes up and down. We can see there's actually a weakened effect on the affective dimension. Here we ask people what kind of emotions they experience here and now. Yesterday, did you feel happy, sad, worried, angry, lonely? That's what we're interested in when it comes to the second dimension. And we actually have some great studies on that, because in the UK, they have used smartphones. So people have signed up for a study, and every time, or every day, they are asked 1 to 3 times how happy they are right now. And they can also ask people, what are you doing, who are you with? And because of the GPS, they can see where are people at. They can see when people are in the countryside, they're happier than when people are in the cities. They can also see when people are at work, they're less happy than when they are at home. Actually, one of the worst things people experience is being ill in bed at home, but the second one is being at work. But they can also see what days are people happier. And yes, they are happier on the weekends than they are on weekdays. But they could also see the happiest day in the UK in 2016 was Christmas Day. Any guesses on what the unhappiest day was 2016 in the UK? Brexit is a good bet. It was actually 4th place in terms of unhappiness. The reason why it wasn't higher is that half the country thought it was a really good idea. No, the unhappiest day was November 9th. We woke up and Donald Trump was elected president. And I think it's really interesting that we can see the impact of global political events in happiness data like this. So that's the second dimension, impacted by weather, impacted by weekday, impacted by Trump's election, very volatile. The third dimension is built on what Aristotle thought the good life was. So to him, the good life was the meaningful life. So do people have a sense of purpose? And here we can, for example, see when people have kids, that's a wonderful, tremendous, positive impact that have on our sense of purpose. So life satisfaction, positive, negative emotions on a daily basis, and a sense of purpose. Those are the dimensions we try to measure happiness with. And basically, we're interested in what matters. I'm interested in how you feel about your life. I think you are the best judge to tell us whether you are happy or not. And that is what we're trying to put at the core of what we're trying to achieve, how people feel about their own lives. And yes, that is subjective. Yes, that is difficult to measure. But I think that people forget that we try to understand and study a lot of things that are subjective. Loneliness, stress, depression are also subjective phenomena. All of these things, but also happiness, is about how we as individuals experience our lives. And then what we do is we follow people over time. We break happiness down into different components, and then we study you. We follow you. Not in a sort of creepy stalker kind of way, but every year we ask people different dimensions of happiness, how happy they are. And therefore we can see how changes in their life circumstances impact happiness levels. For example, we can see in year 0, that's when people became unemployed. Because if we follow 10,000 people over 10 years, some people get promoted, some people become unemployed. And here we see the average effect of, for instance, unemployment on happiness. We can also see the impact of marriage on happiness. Marriage happens in year 0. Men are blue, women are red. And yes, people do get happier from marriage, but that sort of sets over time. But for us, it's interesting to see what is the cause and what is the effect of some of these things. Then our work also leads to questioning why are the Nordic countries often doing well in these happiness rankings. And yes, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Iceland are doing well. They're usually in the top 10 of the World Happiness Report. There's 155 countries in that one. The Czech Republic is 21st, in the latest report, so you're actually doing really well. And is one of the countries that have increased also over the past 10 years. So well done on that. When we look at the 155 countries, from the Scandinavian top to Syria, Afghanistan at the bottom, there's 6 factors that explain the difference between those. And those are the ones I want to focus on. Social support, like Veronica mentioned, health, freedom, money, trust, and kindness. But my proposition here is actually also, because there is a focus of kindness, here I'm told, that I think kindness is actually an element in all of these. I think one of the causes of happiness is being kindness, or is being kind to other people. And I'll try and show you how I think all of those things are related not just to happiness, but also to kindness. So first, one of the most important factors we can see why some people are happier than others is their relationships. Social support. Do they have somebody they can rely on in times of need? And like happiness, social support can be difficult to measure. How do you measure the power of a relationship? How do you measure the strength of a marriage? I think that's very difficult. But one of the ways to do it is, again, to break that down and look at different components. Because loneliness, for instance, if we look at that, can both be me being by myself at home on a Friday night, wanting to be with other people, without anyone to be with. But it can also be me in a crowded room without feeling that I connect with other people. Those are both dimensions of loneliness. And we can see that's a big predictor of happiness. And I think when we link that to kindness, I think one of the ways to improve connection, improve togetherness, improve a sense of community is also to try and look at these questions and ask whether there is something we can do here to improve how other people would ask these questions or answer these questions. I think that's the kind thing to do, not just ask them on our behalf and answer them on our behalf, but is there somebody in our network, if we were kind, that we would help them answer these questions in a different way. Health. No big surprise. We can see when people get sick, they become less happy. That's an obvious one. But we can also see there's the reverse relationship. We can see that happiness keeps people healthy. It's a two-way street. So one of the studies on the relationship between health and happiness is a British study where they followed 8,000 people over 52 for 5 years. So for 60 months, they followed this group of people. In the beginning of the study, they were asked on the affective dimension how happy they were, what kind of emotions they experienced on a daily basis. And what they could see was the happiest third, is the red one, had a much lower mortality rate over the next 5 years. The unhappiest ones, is the blue ones, they had a higher mortality rate. So the unhappier ones died more frequently. And some would say, well, maybe they were just unhappy because they were sick at the beginning of the study, but they control for health status at the beginning of the study. So what we can see from several studies is that happiness keeps people healthy. There is this dual relationship. But I think when it comes to kindness, there is an even more interesting study. So in the US, a group of researchers have looked at the relationship between heart diseases, the mortality of heart diseases, which is the diagram you see here behind me. The more red the state is, or the more red the county is, the higher frequency of deaths by heart disease. That's an objective data point. Interestingly, we can combine that data point with what kind of language do people use on Twitter. Because yes, heart rate or heart diseases is connected with obesity and diabetes, but it's also a apparently connected with what kind of language we use with each other on social media. So they looked at what kind of words are connected with a higher mortality rate from heart diseases. Any guesses on what the most predictive word was that would explain deaths from heart attack in a county? No? Sorry? Pissed? Close? Buck? Somewhat? Yep. Other ideas? So hate. Hate was the single most predictive word that explained high level of heart disease mortalities in a county level. And I think that shows, again, the power of language, that if we are unkind to other people, if we hate each other, if we use words like fuck and pissed, that actually has an effect not just on our community, but also on our own health, on our likelihood of a heart disease. So the advice when it comes to health, happiness, is simply be kind, be nice, use nice language. We can disagree, there's no need to use harsh language. So, because of the relationship between health and happiness, we're really interested in also understanding, what's the common denominators among those people who exercise a lot. Exercise is, of course, a big factor in terms of health. And here we see the share of people who exercise more than 5 hours per week. At the top end of the list, you have Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. One of the reasons for that is not that, for example, Danes, they enjoy the gym. Nobody enjoys the gym. But Danes, we cycle a lot. So I cycle to work, the majority of students cycle to university, the majority of members in parliament cycle to parliament. So that gives us a lot of exercise into our daily routine. And of course, we cannot all cycle to work, but perhaps we can all try and build in some exercise or micro-exercise in our daily routine. So what I try to do at work is every day when I have coffee at the office, I order it downstairs, and instead of waiting for the coffee to be ready, I walk up the 4 floors of my building and back down, and when I come back down, my coffee is ready. And because I drink a lot of coffee over 1 week, that goes actually to the equivalent of climbing up to the top of the Empire State Building in New York. So I think that's a little easy way to build in some exercise into the daily routine. And we are looking at, very good. So we can also see that there is, unfortunately, sorry to say, there is a relationship between money and happiness. We can see on average, richer people are happier. So these are European numbers. We have high income levels to the right, low income levels to the left, and happiness levels upwards. So yes, overall, richer people are happier. But I think it's very important that you notice where the difference is. The big difference is going from low income to mid-income. Once we reach mid-income, additional income going to high income does not seem to have the same impact on happiness. So here we see what we see in other areas. There is diminishing marginal return. The more we have of something, the less pleasure we get from it, right? The first beer you have here today, marvelous, great, the sun is shining. Beer number 20, probably not a good idea, right? So the same with money. The more we have of something, the less utility we derive from it. And I think that's also why taxes is actually good for happiness. And what is taxes? Taxes is actually kindness. Kindness about sharing wealth. So when we look at Denmark, we do pay some of the highest taxes in the world. They also do that in Sweden, Norway, Finland. We have some of the highest taxation in the world. I pay perhaps 50% of my income in tax. But together with 9 out of 10 Danes, we are happily paying our taxes. Because we feel we get a lot of quality of life in return. Because I think there is a recognition that happiness does not come from having a bigger car, but knowing that everybody I know and care for is taken care of. That my happiness also depends on how you guys are doing. And that is kindness, not just in terms of other people, but also, I think, in terms of kindness to yourself, wanting to build a society where we build schools instead of prisons. I think those things are linked. But especially American journalists will say, how can you be so happy? You pay some of the highest taxes in the world. And I like to turn it around and say, maybe we are happy because we are paying high taxes. Because we're creating a society where people are taken care of. That's the kind way, that's the clever way, I think, to build a society. So the question is, of course, if we can see that people who are richer are happier, and countries who are richer also on average are happier, then why don't we get happier as we get richer? We've seen that in the US, we've seen that in a lot of the developed world, that we have gotten tremendously richer over the past decades without getting happier. Well, part of the reason is what I talked about before, diminishing marginal return from money. The first money we get, we buy food. We buy housing, we buy stuff for our kids. But if you're already making a lot of money, if you already have everything you need, if you then get an additional $1,000, you spend them on Serenity dog pots. I don't even think the dog looks very happy. But this is diminishing marginal return. We spend money that doesn't bring any happiness return. The second reason why we get happier, why we get richer without getting happier, is that we care about our relative position. We not only care about absolute income, so how much money do we make, but we care about relative income. How much money do I make compared to everybody else? So to put bluntly, having a Mercedes in the garage is fine until the neighbor suddenly drives up in a Ferrari, right? It's also said that a happy man is a man who makes 100 euros more than his wife, sister's husband, right? We care about our position in the social hierarchy, and that's why we care about relative income over absolute income. And when we get richer as a country, maybe we double our income, everybody, and we're still stuck in the same place in the social hierarchy. So I think this also is why we should think about how we design our cities. I think we should design them for happiness. I think we should design them for people. I think we should design them for kindness. I think right now we are making the mistake in a lot of places of designing cities for cars and not for people. So this is Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and I was there a couple of years ago, and I was staying in a hotel a couple of 100 meters from the botanical garden. And I thought, okay, I like plants, I'll go over and have a look. And I gave up halfway because even though it was only a couple of 100 meters, there was no pavement, there was no way for me as a pedestrian to get to the botanical garden. And I think when we invest in infrastructure, but forget about pedestrians and cyclists, we are creating cities for cars, and we are essentially telling our citizens, if you do not own a car, you are a second-rate citizen. And I think that's the wrong way to design cities. I think we should design them for pedestrians. I think we should design them for cyclists. I think it's important to design our infrastructure so pedestrians and cyclists feel like kings and queens of the road, not the cars. So these are examples from Copenhagen. There's several bridges only reserved for pedestrians and cyclists. The trash cans have some places been tilted because we like to ride our bikes, we also like to drink our coffee, and the combination we also really like. So in order for people to be able to throw their coffee cup away, the trash cans are children. But there's also something as simple as having a footrest for cyclists. So when you're waiting for the green light, you can just relax instead of getting off the saddle, which is really annoying. And here it says, hey cyclists, rest your foot here and thank you for cycling. And I think having a city that gives these little ingredients of kindness, saying thank you for cycling, it makes the city better, it makes it less polluted, it makes us all healthier, it reduces the noise pollution, it reduces the traffic congestion. Thanks. I think that's a kind city, and I think that's a clever city that is designed for people and not for cars. So I think in terms of city design, what we also need to do is we need to have great public spaces. We need to have spaces where people want to go and can enjoy life without paying any money. So one of the great things I enjoy in Copenhagen is going to the harbor to have a swim. So they cleaned up the water in the harbor, and now the water is so clean that people can have a swim in it in the summertime. And yes, in all honesty, our summer lasts about 2 days, and then it's back to winter again, but those 2 days are really amazing, okay? But now, to me, this is one of the great things I enjoy about Copenhagen. After work, going down there, having a swim with my friends, that is free. It's something I can enjoy whether I lost my job and my money tomorrow. And I think having cities that do this, that invests in public infrastructure for people to enjoy life, to enjoy quality of life without spending any money, is a kind, clever, and happy city. This is me a couple of weeks ago. Great style, by the way. So as mentioned, freedom is one of the 6 factors where we can see that explains why some people are happier than others. And as with happiness, freedom can also be difficult to measure. How do you measure the level of freedom in a country? And there is something called the Human Freedom Index. It measures freedom of speech, freedom of the press, is there equal inheritance rights for men and women? A lot of indicators. And if we take that index and combine it with a happiness index, yes, at a country level, we do see a connection. Freer countries are happier. And these are some of the factors they measure. Religion, movement, all the classic rights. But I think they forget an important component of freedom, and that is time. How we spend our time. Are we forced to work 2 jobs to maintain a normal lifestyle, or is 37 hours per week enough? So what I hear from a lot of expats when they move to, for example, Copenhagen from England, London, New York, one of the reasons why they experience an increase in quality of life is the better balance between work and life. A shorter work week, not so much overtime, longer vacations, maternity leave of 12 months for women and men. And I think this is overlooked when we look at the freedom indexes. And it's interesting to see when we look at how these work-life policies impact happiness levels. Because if we take children and how children impact our happiness, they're wonderful in terms of that sense of purpose I talked about earlier. There's sort of mixed results in terms of what kind of emotions we experience on a daily basis with kids. We become really frustrated, but it can also make us really happy. But when we look at life satisfaction, we can see the impact of kids are different in different countries. And this shows us the impact of these policies. When we look at are parents happier or less happy than people without kids, this is the picture. So on the worst case scenario, we have the US. So in the US, people with kids, parents, are 12% less happy than people without kids. In the UK, it's 8%. the positive end of the scale. In Portugal, people with kids, so parents, are happier than people without kids. Now, does this mean that Portuguese kids are nicer than American kids? Maybe. But maybe it's also the policies. Maybe it's also the conditions under which you are a family. And that's why I think it's interesting to look at Norway, Sweden, Finland. In those countries, parents are also happier than people without kids. Again, it's not because the Scandinavian kids are nicer, but it's because there's an easier time being a family. There's a better work-life balance. There's an easier condition for being a family and maintaining a interesting career. So I think in an ideal world, we all have Scandinavian family-friendly policies and Portuguese grandparents. We're still working out how we can get to that. But coming back to Scandinavia and the policies, it might be one of the explanations why we see a different pattern when we look at the relationship between age and happiness. So usually, when we look globally and look at happiness and age levels, we have, I think for a lot of you, bad news, okay? You are quite happy now, we're happy when we're young, and then it's all downhill till we reach about 44. That's the low point for happiness, and then it looks like it increases. So we get happier as we get older. That's what it looks like. But unfortunately, the bad news here is, remember earlier I talked about how happiness keeps people healthy? The trouble with this is, one of the reasons why it looks like people get happier as we get older is that the unhappy ones have died off. And that increases the average of happiness levels among the survivors. So that's the bad news. So this is the global picture we get. But if we look at Scandinavia, we can see that there isn't the same drop midlife. One of the explanations for the drop midlife is that it's this time in the mid-40s where a lot of people feel pressured. There's a career they want to fulfill, but there's also a demanding family life. And when we look at Scandinavia, that might not be the same case. It's an easier time being a family there. So in terms of kindness, I think the lesson from Portugal, the country where parents were happier, was looking at how much grandparents are involved in bringing up the kids. In my culture, perhaps also in yours, the family is very little. It's the two parents and the kids. But in Southern Europe, in Portugal, in Spain, the grandparents are much more inclined to be involved in raising the kids. So instead of just being two stressed parents, there's a team of 6 parents and grandparents who are helping bringing up the kids. So for your own happiness sake, be kind and invite grandparents into their lives of the grandkids, get them involved, and if you're a grandparent, maybe turn down the golf lessons and get involved in happiness for your grandparents. So we can see trust is also one of the factors. In societies where we see high levels of trust, there is also higher levels of happiness. And you can measure trust in different ways. You can ask people, like they've done with this study behind me, do you feel that most people can be trusted, or can't you become too careful when it comes to strangers? And in the Nordic countries, the majority of people will say, yes, you can trust most strangers. But I think it's actually a much more interesting thing to look at manifestations of trust in society. So when you walk around Copenhagen, what you'll see is that parents leave their kids outside in strollers when they're inside having a cup of coffee or going to the shop. To me, that's a great manifestation of trust. And we see this relationship between high levels of trust and happiness levels at a national level. But I think a much more cool and interesting study on trust is the wallet experiments. So scientists around the world have created trust experiments. So basically, they've taken wallets containing a day's worth of pay in cash and business cards or some sort of ID, and then drop the wallets on streets to see how many of the wallets are returned with the money intact. And the average number of wallets that were returned around the world was 50. Prague is up there. Or down there, depending on it. So 25, but still, I mean, 25% of the wallets were returned with the money intact. Is that higher or lower than you expected? Okay, raise of hands, how many expected fewer wallets to be returned in Prague? 1. Okay, how many expected more wallets to be returned? Okay, you have a lot of trust in people, I think that's good. But I think, the lesson here is be trustworthy, be kind, return wallets, it's obvious. But I think this is a great study. It shows, can people be trusted? And of course, no society is perfect. Even though there's high levels of trust in Scandinavia and there's a high level of wallets being returned. I lost my phone on a train in Denmark a couple of years ago, and the phone wasn't returned. And I was furious, not because I lost with my phone, because it messed with my statistics. So, of course, there's bad apples everywhere. So, that brings us to, I think, the most important point, and that is kindness. Being kind to other people, either by engaging in random acts of kindness or getting involved in volunteer work. And in my work, I meet a lot of very inspiring people. But I think one of the most inspiring people I met over the past years is this guy. I call him Clark. But that's not his real name, because he's a kind of a superhero. So he lives in London. He lives in London, and he's known as the free help guy. So Clark's story is that he helps other people for free. So he has tried to help a young girl find a donor for a bone marrow transplant. She was suffering from cancer. He has tried to help reconnect a father with his lost son. He has sat next to a guy on several planes because the guy needed to get over his fear of flying. But it's something that started a few years ago, and Clark was working in central London, and every day he took the metro, the tube, into Oxford Circus Station. And he was in his mid-20s and going to work and just feeling sort of not very passionate about what he did. And he thought, well, is this really it? Is this what I'm going to do with my life? And then, for some reason, he decided to quit and give himself 6 months to find some sort of purpose and meaning in life, where he could earn his worth in something else than pounds and pennies. And this was a few years ago, so the first week he watched Breaking Bad all week, the TV show. But then after 1 week, for some reason, he decided to write online, is there somebody I can help? I'll do it for free, the free help guy. And the first people to respond to that, and that was within a day, was a couple who had earlier housed a homeless person, but now that homeless person had gotten a job and didn't need the room anymore. So they asked him, can you help us find somebody else to help? And that became the first step in a journey where he has helped all these people. And now it's been several years, and despite him saying, well, I only want to do it 6 months, now it's something that he wants to make his life mission. It's something that he wants to do for the rest of his life. Because despite helping people reconnect with their dads and trying to find donors for bone marrow transplants, he says that the person who has been helped the most by this project is me. And I remember him saying, my heart beats in a way that it never has before. And I think he's a great example of how kindness towards others can lead to happiness to ourselves. And it's actually something we see a lot in the data. we see kindness impacts happiness in several ways. We can see random acts of kindness. So for instance, when you're in Prague and you see tourists like me with a map upside down and we're lost, helping them find our way. That's a random act of kindness. We can see in brain scans, people experience there something called helper's high. We feel good by doing good. And we are wired to do that because what is good for the survival of the species triggers the reward center in our brain. So it triggers when we have sugar, when we eat burgers, when we have sex. It triggers the reward center. That's good for the survival of the species. But helping each other out is also good for the survival of a species. So we can get a little bit of a high by helping others. That's the short term. But long term, engaging in volunteer work, engaging in charity also impacts not just how we feel here and now, but also overall life satisfaction and the sense of purpose. Talking about Aristotle, his belief about the good life. But the reason why we see people report higher levels of life satisfaction when we follow them over time, and some people engage in kindness through volunteer work, one of the reasons is that we connect with other people. It becomes a platform for new friendships, even perhaps romantic relationships, but also gives us this sort of sense of purpose, gives us some structure to our day, gives us also a sense of gratitude, because some lines of volunteer work will expose you to how other people, perhaps less fortunate than you, live their lives. And also, remember how we saw when people lost their jobs, unemployment has a negative effect on life satisfaction. It is less so when people are engaged in kindness, when then they are engaged in volunteer work, because it gives them a second leg to stand on in terms of their identity. So there are all sorts of reasons why we should be kind. The trouble is, of course, how do we measure that? How do we measure the level of kindness among people? And one of the ways to do that is to go around cities in the world, around the world, and, for example, to pretend you are blind. Standing in front of a red light or trying to cross the street and see whether people come up and help you. And people have done this. So scientists have looked at how inclined are people around the world to help strangers in need. Blind people who need to cross the street, people who are on crutches, who needs to pick something up, are people inclined to help them. And what they see is, actually the Brazilians are some of the kindest people in the world. Also, people are, unfortunately, less kind in bigger cities. The bigger the density of the city, the less level of kindness. So maybe we need to take a little bit of the village feeling that a lot of us grew up with and put it into the bigger cities. So if you met somebody in a village who needed help, how would you act and trying to bring that into the bigger cities? I think that's a way forward in terms of kindness. So another way to measure kindness is, of course, to look at whether people look kind. So do people smile on the street? Do they smile to you? And I've actually done a study of that. So over a course of 5 years, I collected the frequency of smiles on streets in cities around the world. So I enjoy what I'm sure all of you like to do when you visit a city. You find a nice cafe, you sit down, you have a cup of coffee, and you look at people. I did the same. I just systematically registered whether people smiled or not. So we needed to do it in a scientific way. So we needed to randomize who we observed, because otherwise, I mean, we would look at, people who laughed loud or people who were wearing bright red dresses. So we needed to make it random who we would look at. So if we were doing the study now, we're saying, okay, the first person who comes in the door, we'll observe them, welcome. We'll observe them for, now we've ruined the study, but we'll observe them for 5 seconds, and we'll note down, men, women, will estimate the age, will note down what are they doing. And there we can see under which circumstances do people look friendly, under which circumstances do people smile. And what we found was, or just a bit more about method, this is in Guadalajara in Mexico, 4.5 million inhabitants, a very diverse city, therefore very difficult to get a representative spread of the population, because you both have areas like this in Guadalajara where people are relatively poor, where they will sell hair, or where you can buy hair, but you also have high-rise areas with luxury malls and so on. So when you do these studies, it's important to get a representative cut of the population. But the results are these. So Malaga, Milan, Copenhagen, we saw really high levels of smiling. New York, Dublin, London, very low levels of smiling. So I think it's important to underline some things here. What we found was that circumstances, or the best predictor of whether people smile or not, is not where they are from, but whether they are in company with other people. If we walk with other people, we are more inclined to smile, we are more inclined to look friendly. If we're walking by ourselves, there's not a lot of smiling going on. If you smile by yourself, sometimes people think you're crazy, right? But I think this is actually one of the key to understand the pattern we see. People do not necessarily smile more in Malaga than in New York. It's just in Malaga they are more inclined to walk with other people. Now you're all together with other people, so I think these frames, these circumstances, this platform is also a very good invitation to show some kindness, to share a smile. It's often the shortest distance between people, and that is smiling. What I also found in the studies was if you want people to smile, the easiest way to get that is actually to smile at them. So this is a relationship between whether people are in company with other people and whether they are likely to smile or not. So one of the last questions I wanted to leave you with is questioning whether we can design for kindness. Can we design our education systems? Can we design our cities for kindness? And I think the cities, we already covered that, but in terms of education system, I think in many countries our education systems are designed like this. It's a zero-sum game. So we are competing against each other. You guys, are you familiar with the game called musical chairs, right? You have 8 people, 7 chairs, you play music, music stop, you sit down, and the one without the chair, out of the game. And then I have to stand and watch the game for 20 minutes. Fun stuff. So this is usually how we play the game. In Denmark, I think we try to change it a little bit and create it a little bit more kinder sort of musical chairs. So in my latest book, I actually wrote about it, and there was a teacher who sent me a picture of them repeating that game. So it's a kind sort of musical chairs. So you still have the same proposition. You have 8 people, you have 7 chairs. You play music, the music stops, and you sit down. But here it's fine if 2 people sit on one chair. And then you remove one chair, you play music again, you stop, and perhaps now 3 people have to sit on the same chair. And in the end, you end up with one chair, and everybody has to try and balance on it. I think that's a much more fun and kinder game than the classical musical chairs. And I think if we design our education systems this way, if we teach kids that working together, cooperation, empathy, there's actually a lot of value in that, instead of just competing against each other, I think we're teaching our kids something really well. So in my latest book, I wanted to get people's help, because I was looking for things that brought happiness to people. And in my book, I'm bringing out some cases, but I also really wanted people's help in being my eyes, in terms of finding examples of initiatives, of activities that brought happiness to people. And I asked them to use a hashtag called Look for Lykke on Instagram, and now we have almost 2,000 people have posted pictures there with examples of things that bring them happiness. And a lot of them shows pictures of kindness. You know, one person, his neighbors are great people, you know, sharing fruit, and I think it was a young woman who had just made additional vegetable soup and shared it with a homeless person. So I think that's a wonderful, reassuring statement for me, that so many people are producing evidence of kindness that are bringing happiness around the world. The last question I wanted to pose to you is inspired by these people, but also based on your own sort of experience. Can we just spend 30 seconds in silence, but considering this question? You know, which act of kindness could you do? It could be the fruit, it could be the soup, it could be whatever. But just consider, what act of kindness could I engage in? We'll just take 20 more seconds to consider that. It's always really cool to have a big room of people with silence. But that was 20 seconds. Did you think of something you could do? Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to share what it was, but did you all think of something? Show of hands, did you think of something? Okay. So now I'm going to ask you to take out your phones and plot down November 13th. So that's the World Kindness Day, which would be a great day to engage in the act of kindness you just thought of. So maybe when you leave here, note down November 13th, World Kindness Day, be superheroes of kindness, and spread a little of happiness to others, but also get a little of happiness in return. I encourage you at least to do so, and thank you so much for listening. I think we have a couple of minutes, 4 minutes, five for either your questions or your questions. I'll let that be up to you, Veronica.
Sure. No, I think we should give a chance to the people if they want to ask something. Guys? Okay, let me bring it to you.
Hi, I really like public spaces in Copenhagen. I love that city. And my question is, I assume it wasn't always like that. When was and why was when was the turning point,
yeah.
and what started? What was the impulse for that?
Well, it's a very good question. I think it was in the 60s. So at that time, Copenhagen was also, like many other cities, you know, focused on cars, and let's just pave over the green areas and the lakes with asphalt and make room for cars. And then one of the architects at the time, called Jan Gehl, suggested that, why don't we try a different approach? And one thing that was suggested at that time, I think it was 1962, was there was a street, sort of main street in the town, 2 kilometers long, there was a lot of traffic, and there was a discussion about banning bicycles from that street. And then they suggested, well, why don't we ban the cars from the street and try that approach? And there was an outcry from the shops and said, no, you can't ban the cars, we'll go bankrupt. And the politicians were like, okay, let's make it a 6-month trial period. And it became a huge success. Now it's a 2-kilometer long pedestrian street. Also, you can ride there with your bicycle. And it's the most expensive shopping street in Copenhagen. And I think that became the sort of tipping point, or not the starting point, in terms of, okay, let's try and build the city for people and not for cars. And he's a great architect. He's in his 70s today. He's still around, and I think he owes a big part of the reason why Copenhagen, I think, is also a great city for livability. There's a book called Cities for People that sort of sums up his knowledge. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend that. Yeah. So I think in the 60s, and I think that is also encouraging that in a matter of 30, 40, 50 years, Copenhagen actually transformed itself from being a mainstream car-oriented city to something that is great in terms of green transportation. Yeah.
Guys, then there's time for like one last quick question. Meik, what is the topic of your third book?
You're starting to sound like my editor now.
Oh, you already signed the contract?
I've signed a contract.
We didn't know that.
But actually, we haven't necessarily agreed on what it will be. But these days, I'm really interested in why we remember what we remember. You know, what are the ingredients in happy memories?
So is there a connection between happiness and memory?
That's what I'm trying to solve. I mean,
you don't know yet.
Yeah. So it's. I think it will be around nostalgia and basically how we can create and remember happy memories.
Are you gonna come to Czech to present it?
I think so. I think so.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.